Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today's Democratic Party is increasingly perceived as dominated by its woke left wing. But the views of Democrats on social media often bear little resemblance to those of the wider Democratic electorate. That's as reported by the New York Times on April 9th, 2019. The article goes on to explain that perhaps the most telling poll of the Democratic primary season hasn't been about the Democratic primary at all, but rather about the fallout from a 35-year-old racist photo on a yearbook page. Governor of Virginia was pummeled on social media after the revelation, and virtually every Democratic presidential candidate demanded his resignation. Yet the majority of ordinary Democrats in Virginia said that Mr. Northam should remain in office, according to the Washington Post. And Black Democrats were likelier than white ones to say that he should remain. What's going on? Why does it feel like the Democratic Party has jolted to the left? Is that the reality? Well, those are the questions that we hope to answer today. Why do you care? Maybe you're a Republican tuning in. If you are, we're so glad that you're here. I'm not sure if Lance would qualify as a Republican or if I would, but we really do want that conversation. And I think we've got a Republican in the control room. So we're happy that you're here because this is relevant to understanding where we're at as a nation and not allowing ourselves to be pulled into a particular mindset that might be perpetrated by a lot of the mainstream cable news media. So that's why it matters, because it's important to be informed, even if it's about the other side of the aisle. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on Democrats and the far left without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
I have never liked it when we put people in a box. They're a Democrat or Republican. Place a label on them. We should be able to be more free, independent thinkers and come down on whatever side of an issue you want based on that issue. You mean not based on whether or not you're a party ticket Republican or a party ticket Democrat.
So you mean you're more than just who you voted for in the last election?
I would hope so.
Really?
I would hope people realize that they don't brand you based on who you voted for. Well, since you voted for them, you must think this, this, and this, because that's totally incorrect with most of the people that I've talked to. And there are lots of people that I consider friends who I can no longer talk politics with because they do that. And it's sad because there was a time when I could talk politics with them. So it's not that this was something we could never talk about. We used to have all kinds of discussions, but now it's almost an us versus them mentality that if you're with me, you're the good guys. And if you're against me, you're the bad guys. You know, if you voted for my person, then I can be your friend. If you didn't vote for my person, then I can't be your friend because you're the enemy. And this tribalism is tearing the country apart.
Couldn't agree more. That's why we're doing this, right? I mean, today.
I hope so.
But also the larger purpose of what we're trying to do, Lance, is
I think we try to do it every day.
Right. That's what I'm getting at, is that we try to let people know that it's not always quite as left and right as we, and when I say we, the media in general sometimes makes it out to be. And it's not always intentional, I don't think. I'm sure that it is sometimes. You know, I wouldn't dispute that the purpose of Sean Hannity's show and the purpose of Rachel Maddow's show is not to make us believe that we all think more alike than we do different. That's not what their programs are geared toward. That's okay. There's a place for that, right? I mean, there's a place to spend time with your own camp, but it can't come with no willingness to spend time in other camps. And that's the problem, I think, is it's too far. It's too, I won't, like Lance said, you have friends who I can't talk about that now. You know, that's the problem. It doesn't have to be that we all agree on the same thing or that we all think the same. It just has to be that we can at least sit at the table and discuss these things. And the problem is we're getting so far away from that. But the good news is, Lance, and to me, that's what this article is as we get into this. It's really, I think, more good news than bad. The bad news is that people don't realize this is the case because the people who are closer to the middle, the people who are more moderate on both the right and the left, historically, they are much quieter than the extremes. Why is that? I'll tell you what I think, and Lance has thoughts, I'm sure, too. But that's because, I mean, think about it, right? If you're out there on the wings and you got these crazy ideas, the only way that anybody pays attention to you is if you scream and shout. That's how you get noticed, because most people don't feel that way and most people don't think that way. So you got to be noisy, you got to be loud, and that's what gets noticed. But then everybody else, if the people in the middle of the party don't stand up and say, no, wait a minute, that's not how most of us think, then it becomes, well, the Democrats are all wanting to become socialists. They all want Medicare for all. They all love the Green New Deal. And that's what all Democrats think. Just like it becomes every Republican, must think exactly like Donald Trump, and they all think immigration is this big catastrophe, and they all believe that climate change is a hoax, and that's just not true either. It's just not the way it is. We have a gentleman, our producer, Caleb, who more than agrees that climate change is a big problem and that we have to take it seriously, and yet is somebody, I think, who would identify as a Republican. He's shaking his head. You can't see it, but he does exist. We promise. He's not imaginary. So that to me, Lance, is the starting point of this, is those people are louder than everybody else. And I think that's what the article reinforces. But tell me, I mean, are you in a different spot here on that? Is that why is it that we hear more from them than we do from the moderate? Is it less sexy, maybe?
No, I mean, if you mention where's the entertainment value on my show, if I bring in people who actually are positive, who see good in things and other people, and who realize there's common ground from which we can all work from, why would I watch a show like that? So I have to pick the far right and far left speakers to talk to each other because that's what's going to get me audience numbers. And I need audience numbers so I can sell advertising and so I can keep my hour-long spot.
Yep.
So that's
should
where
politics and news, though, should they be entertainment? I mean, I'd like to think that our show's not boring,
but that's
right?
what it's been, right? Who owns Fox? Rupert Murdoch, who made all of his money in publishing, and so it's all about selling. It's all about making money. And so you need an audience. Well, you get an audience by being controversial. You get an audience by, and again, as I said earlier, we're in this time period of tribalism where we need to group together. We need to band to go against those that we're warring against on the other side. And so that's what we do. We group and then fight the other side because it's good versus evil. And instead of saying, you know what, we're all Americans, let's sit here and have an intellectual, common sense discussion here, and let's find out what points we agree on, then let's get those done. And then let's take the parts we disagree on. Can we find some common ground and move in that direction? And that's what we used to do. That's what we did, to borrow a phrase. That's what we did when America was great, was that we didn't automatically dislike one another based on our political affiliations. But unfortunately, that doesn't sell now. That's not what gets me a good market share so that I can keep my job in the news media.
But the reason that and this is, how much this drives me crazy. Well, you know better, I think, than most people. Obviously, nobody knows as much as me. The thing that gets me, because that's what people like you and I go to, right? Is, well, that's what sells now. But why does it sell now? It sells because that's what the media is selling.
Well, but there's also some psychological realities here that the human brain is wired to do that. We've needed to encamp in a strong group so we could survive. Go back to caveman days and everything else, or you're fighting a war. You have to have, I'll fight with my brother, but if my family gets attacked from an outside source, then my brother and I will fight together against the outside source. But if that outside source is my countrymen, then I will fight with my countrymen against that invading force from outside of our country. So we have this need to bond and to come together with other people to fight the evil people. And that's all that the media is playing off of now.
Is good versus evil.
Right. They're fighting off of that
from different perspectives.
Sure. But there's a psychological background here that's a truism. That's a realism. So
built in.
It's a built-in thing that they're taking advantage of to make money off of.
And
further divide the country, in my opinion.
Because we haven't had a something on the scale of like a World War II in quite a long time. I mean, is that fair? I mean,
that's the last I remember is the attack on the World Trade Center.
Right.
Is something that I could put into when Americans set aside their differences and we all supported the president and we all supported Congress and we came together as a nation to try to do something good. That would be the last big event that I think really brought us together as a country, where we set aside our differences and walked hand in hand to try to find a solution. Now, we didn't agree on the solution.
Right.
But for, a period of time there,
we quit bickering with each other.
Exactly. And we worked for the common good.
So I guess what I was getting at with hearkening back to World War II is for example, the 9/11 the bonding of the country didn't last as long. And it's probably because, in my analysis of that, it's probably because you were in a situation where the enemy was less known. It was more difficult to materialize both who the enemy was and what victory looked like, right? When we were fighting a world war, it was pretty clear this is the enemy, and the way we win is by taking this area.
Right.
If we do X, Y, Z, and we go kill the bad guys, we got it, and that's, I think, how we kind of started 9/11, right? But then it was, it's hard to know now exactly who the bad guys are. And this is a little more complicated and not as clean cut. And then I think that's why that fell apart a little bit more. I agree. It started that way. You have the highest approval number ever in history for a president, 93% or 92% for George W. Bush, right? After 9/11. So, indisputed that the country was together, regardless of what you thought about him before. At that moment, everybody was like, yup, the president, or 92% of the country, which in this country that's as high as you're ever going to get on something. That might as well be everybody. So I guess that little side note there, just to say, it seems, in other words, that when we're willing to work together is when we're facing some kind of existential threat. Is that a fair summary of what you were getting at?
Yes.
Okay. So then let's look at the numbers here real quick. Then this, again, is from this article that we're referencing. So the way they broke this down, Lance, is we've got the percentage of Democrats on social media versus the percentage of other Democrats. So we've got all these categories that I'm going to go through, and those are the two percentages. So Democrats who post political content on social media are more likely to have a college degree. That's 47% of those on social media versus 33% of other Democrats. Before I go on, I just want to mention this is people who, again, note, post political content. Okay. So that doesn't mean that these others are not on social media. They might not be, but many of them are, and they don't put stuff out there. Right. For example, that was me for many years. The only reason it's changed now, and I'm being 100% honest, Lance, right? Transparency is this campaign that I'm running. The only reason that I'm posting stuff now is because of that. It's not because I have a personal need to do that. So that's important to note. I just want to make sure people are clear. That's not of those on social media. It's of those who are posting political content on social media. So it's very specific. So 47% who are posting political content versus 33% of other Democrats. Who are white, 71% of Democrats posting on social media, Lance, are white versus 55% of all Democrats. 53% of Democrats posting political content on social media say that they have become more liberal in their lifetime versus just 30% of other Democrats. 28% of the ones on social media say they've attended a protest in the last year in comparison with 7% of other Democrats. 45% of Democrats posting political content on social media say that they've donated to a political organization in the last year versus 14% of other Democrats. So there's a few to start with. We'll get into some other stats, but hopefully that demonstrates there's this pretty significant margin, right? Not only are the ones posting political content more likely to be more extreme, they're also more likely to be white, more likely to have a college degree, more likely to have become more liberal in their lifetime, and they're more likely to be actively engaged by donating to political organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Again, doesn't make them bad or good, right? It's just you got to understand who is saying these things. Just like on the right, you have to understand that too. Who is saying this stuff? Is it all Democrats or is it some Democrats? And I think that what this shows us, right, is that it's some Democrats.
Exactly. I think, and again, as you pointed out, and I've been saying, it's important to realize this so that you don't group people together, that you get to know one another and talk to each other. You can't just say, oh, because you're a Democrat or because you're a Republican, you must think this, thus, or so. That's not true.
So we've so far been discussing the Democratic electorate on Twitter and how it's not the actual Democratic electorate. This is all based around a New York Times article. Before we go on, though, I hinted at the beginning of the show, Lance, that we're after achieving this larger purpose, right? I mean, what the State of Us is trying to do is part of what TrueChat, which is our producing company, our network, part of what they're trying to do. And what is that mission that's central to how we operate?
Our mission here at TrueChat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And part of the way that we continue to do that is by working with other organizations who can support us in these efforts. So please keep it right here on the State of Us, and we'll be right back. The outspoken group of Democratic-leaning voters on social media is outnumbered roughly 2-1 by the more moderate, more diverse, and less educated group of Democrats who typically don't post political content online, according to data from the Hidden Tribes Project. That's what we've been talking about so far. It's what we're going to continue our discussion on, but we're going to shift a little bit now, Lance. We're going to shift a little bit. There was this other article that Lance and I took a look at that is entitled, Why Texas is Nearing Battleground Status. It's not just about Beto. And I think this is illustrated, Lance, if we pull up here this chart. Lance has a copy in front of him that shows us where the rest of the Democratic Party lives. Moderates, passive liberals, and disengaged voters as a share of all Democrats. So this is a percentage. Texas, upwards of 60% okay, are moderates, passive liberals, or disengaged voters as a share of Democrats. So we're not talking about all Texans. We're saying of the Democratic Party, 60% in Texas fall into that moderate, passive liberal, or disengaged voter status. So what does that tell us? Just as an example, interesting too where this line is, Lance, don't you think? From a historical standpoint, I know you all can't see this, but we're running pretty much the Deep South line, right? We've got at the top end, you've got the top of Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. At the bottom, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, right? I mean,
the only one you didn't mention, South Carolina, which is wedged between Georgia and North Carolina.
Sorry, South Carolina.
The rest of them are either, no, but you're right. The rest of them are either the northern or the southern part of the map. So South Carolina is just wedged right in there, but that is typically the Deep South, which is where these moderates, passive, liberals, and disengaged voters.
Well, and that was telling right in the 2016 election is when you have a voter turnout issue amongst members of your own party, that's where the other party has an opportunity to capitalize. So what does this all mean? What is this all wrapping into? I think what it's wrapping into, Lance, is that we have a growing percentage of Americans on the left and the right. The data we're talking about today just so happens to be on the left that are getting disenfranchised by these way out there advocates of extreme policies. And again, you remember the exit polling? I mean, we covered it, some of it later after the 2016 election. But the exit polling told us what? That most voters, including Republicans, did not view Trump in a positive light. But he's still the president. So that tells us that they didn't like their choices, right?
Exactly.
But the people who showed up and vote are the ones that determine who's elected. And they were obviously the more active and engaged voters because they're the ones that are going to show up even if they don't like the choices, right? As to where the percentages that we're talking about here on this map, the moderates, passive liberals, so forth, they're probably, we're not going to show up. I mean, there's our buddy Camden, right? I'm not wild about anybody. I don't like any of them. So I just, we're not going. And I mean, I can kind of understand that. We face that problem here at a local level, Lance. Voter turnout's pretty low in comparison to those who could vote, less than 50%. Why is that? A lot of times on our ballots, there's one person running for an office. So it's real hard to go convince people who don't like that person to go vote because you can't even use the opposition argument.
Right.
Because, I mean, you can't vote against
them.
There
isn't one.
Right. There's one bubble, and it's for this particular person. That's your only choice. We have bubble and ballots here in Champaign County. So it might be different I'm sure it is different for some of our listeners, but that's how we do it. Old fashioned, right? The pen and the paper. That's how we vote. So where do we go from here, Lance? I mean, great. We've got all this data. People are disenfranchised. We got people screaming real loud on social media, and they apparently happen to be more white, more educated, and more liberal than most of the Democratic Party. Is this not a reflection of what was happening / has continued to happen to the Republicans over the past 10 years? Or 11 years now. I mean, started right around 2008. We began this Tea Party movement, the Jim Jordans, our congressman, right? I mean, this is when they began. What do we do about this? You and I just keep saying, people got to be willing to talk to each other, but there's got to be, how do we break away from these extremists? Because as long as they're there and they keep shouting, it makes it really hard to encourage people like you and I to sit down at the table and talk.
Well, it goes back to what we always talk about on this show, and that is education. Education is supposed to be the place where we can share ideas and discuss things in a civil manner. And right now, that's not taking place on our college campuses. The right feels attacked, the left feels attacked, and people say they feel unsafe anytime someone who has a different opinion wants to speak or wants to have a talk or whose book wants to be read. by a college professor. And then nobody will support that speaker or person or their right to speak, even though I think if you ask the majority of Americans, they all believe in the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. We don't, because we say, well, I feel attacked if someone who thinks differently than me speaks on a topic. I'm being attacked. I'm being put in an unsafe place because this person's sharing viewpoints that offend me or that scare me. And so therefore we've stopped having a natural public debate on the issues. And I think that's where it goes back to is education. We have to allow for this to take place in high schools and colleges where people can have differing viewpoints and talk about a topic and then still walk out of there in a civil manner and still respect each other as citizens. But that's not the case anymore. If you bring up something somebody doesn't like, then all of a sudden you're an evil person. And I'll give, Joe Biden as an example right now. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago, he puts his hands on people, he hugs them. He shows, people would say affection, but I know that I have to be careful because I have, I coach young ladies and they're sobbing, they're upset and they come and they lay their head on my chest, and they want me to put my arm around them and give them some comfort. Okay. Does that mean that these former athletes are going to start coming out of the woodwork and say that I inappropriately touched them? Do I have to say, sorry, hands off. I know you want a hug right now, but I'm a male, you're a female. I can't hug you because this is going to be perceived later by the metoo people as inappropriate touching. But I didn't force myself on you. If you said, you came to me, said, Coach, I need a hug. Coach, I'm crying. Comfort me. Wow, I thought I was just one human being to another human being giving comfort. It could be the same thing with a male.
Yeah.
In that situation. Sure. You're a coach or a teacher and a young man, you're male, and a young man comes in your room and is all upset. And you put your arm around them and they start sobbing. You push them into a desk and say, sit down. Now we got to talk about this because I'm not allowed to give you comfort. Because you may feel like that's inappropriate touching, but you can't tell me that it is because I'm in a position of power. I've heard it all and I've read it all. And so what we've done is we've quit being human beings to one another. We've quit reaching out and being nice to one another and showing that we care about people because we're so concerned about inappropriate touching. We're so worried about invading someone's private space that we've stopped being human. And that just drives me up a wall. But again, it comes to education. That's the education piece where we need to let people know that these things are okay. And just because you perceive it as something bad doesn't mean they meant it as something bad.
Well, and the problem is,
give people the benefit of the doubt.
When we take this kind of stuff, I know you're using the Joe Biden example, but we'll just use it for a second.
Well, just because it's out there.
Right. It's current. It's what people are talking about. The problem, and we've spoken about this before, both Lance and I, is that type of thing delegitimizes the true problem, right? What Me Too started as and what it was about was assault. Mm-hmm. And that's where I have the problem, okay? And I'm not talking about just Me Too. I just mean generally. We go from people's whose rights, right, are being taken away, who are being truly violated, and then we group that with these other people. Maybe you don't want that, but then, it's so different. They're just in different ballparks to me, right? It's not that we can't have that conversation maybe about Biden, but the problem is that's the problem right now is that we can't have that conversation. Nobody has that conversation because the media out there is like, well, we don't want to touch that. We won't touch, here's this 10-foot pole and we're going to stand over here and bring some people on who tell us why this is so important and how we have to take it all seriously. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't because
if you bring it up and argue the other side, then you're blasted for saying that this kind of stuff is okay. No, I'm just showing that there is a different way to look at this, but that's not acceptable anymore. If you defend, it's not really defend. If you show that there's another way to perceive this action, then you're thought of as a cover up, or you're someone who supports these kinds of behaviors or whatever. And so now
you're in their camp, you're part of that team. And it's like, no, that's not what that has to mean. But when you don't bring in the other side, then what happens is the other side never actually comes your way. They just shut up and sit down. And that doesn't actually make it any better. If everybody's just quiet about it and nobody talks about it, it might make some people on the surface feel better, but it doesn't fix the root of the problem. And for those listeners of the show who don't like Donald Trump as a person, okay? So to our producer and to others who like his policies, I'm not talking about that. I mean the human being that the man is. To those people who don't like that, this is what happens, okay? This is what we end up with when there were other options who could still have executed those policies. We end up with this because for too long, for too many years, we pretended and ignored this group of Americans. And they got mad, okay? And so now this is what we have. That's what happens because it doesn't fix it. It just hides it. And then it rears its ugly head at some point, and it's way worse than it had to be if we all just would have talked about it before. And then you could have ended up still with a Republican who could still do some of these policy things that you want, who wasn't this person. Okay. There are other choices, or we wouldn't have ended up with a Republican at all, and maybe not Hillary if we had had these conversations, but we don't do that anymore, as Lance pointed out. And that's what it comes down to. So that's hopefully the point of today's show is the solution, Lance, I guess, is that we have to be willing to stand up to the media and say, no, we need these conversations. Okay. We have to do what Lance and I are doing today and be willing to talk about these tough things and admit that maybe, as Lance has said at the end of several shows within the past 2 months, we'll agree to disagree. And we come back and we do another show, and we keep talking.
It doesn't mean because I disagree with you that you're a bad person, or because I don't agree with your opinion that I'm a bad person. It just means that we're friends who are able to have a discussion and both maybe have, as we try to do, present the facts to support our case. And then that blows people's minds. You mean there's a gray area? There's not a right and wrong? I'm right, you're wrong. You're good, I'm bad.
Different ways to interpret the facts.
Exactly. And that's what this country used to stand for. And I'll go back because I know you like the history.
Yep.
George Washington purposely put Alexander Hamilton on one side and Thomas Jefferson on the other side of him when he became president, because he wanted both sides of the issue so that he could then make the best decision for the country. Mm-hmm. Those two gentlemen, and I'm not throwing that out there because of the musical Hamilton, but that is the historical significance here. George Washington said, you know what? You're two of the brightest men that I've ever talked to, and you totally disagree on what we should do for the country. So I'm going to put you both in my cabinet and have you both whisper in my ear. That way I get the brightest thinkers who disagree, and then I can find the common ground that I think is best for the country. Mm-hmm. Wow. We talk about, boy, I wish we could go back to the way we were. When's the last time a president did that? Brought in people from both sides of the aisles, brought in the best thinkers and said, you know what? I don't care if my 15 cabinet members agree with one another or not. I want to hear what you have to say. And then I'm the president and I'm going to make the best decision based on the information I get from the experts. Because There's no way that one person can be an expert in all the things that you need to be able to run the country properly. So that's what a cabinet's supposed to do. Pick those people. Don't pick your political cronies who are going to whisper in your ear the things you want to hear. And when they don't, you get rid of them. And I'm not just picking on Donald Trump. I'm saying all across the board. Yeah. Bring in the people who know about the topics, listen to them, and then you decide what you think is best. That's what a good leader does. That's what a good CEO does of a company. They shouldn't bring in a bunch of yes people. So again, but there's this.
That doesn't make you better.
No, it doesn't help you grow. It doesn't solve, as you pointed out, it doesn't solve problems. And we have problems in this country. And all of us would probably agree on the problem. Most of us, as we found out from our friends, No Labels, agree on the solution, which we haven't talked about in a long time. But, they did 2 or 3 years ago, talked about all the major issues and found out that 70% of Americans agreed on a solution, but Congress couldn't pass anything. Because if I pass something and it's what you said first, now I'm a supporter of you. And so then the base is going to get me voted out of office in the next election because I happen to agree with somebody on the other side. No, I should be able to agree with what's best for the country, and let's move forward.
From President Ronald Reagan. The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He's the one that gets the people to do the greatest things.
Very good.
Just echoing, when you were bringing that up, I was just thinking of that quote. I saw it and I was like, yep, that's, you don't have to know it all. None of us do. Lance and I don't know it all. You should see our tables. We've got papers everywhere. Most of this stuff is we're reading it and then it's supporting ideas that we had or getting us to think about something a different way that's counter to what we had thought. So that's your challenge today is share the state of us with somebody else. Let's further this conversation. They're not always fun conversations, but they can be so helpful to society. It can't always be about what's easy and what's entertaining. Sometimes it has to be about what's right. And hopefully we're accomplishing that on the State of Us. Let us know at TrueChat.org, at TrueChat.org on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. And Lance, there's a lot of different ways that people can tell others to tune into TrueChat. What are a few of those ways?
Well, there's Apple Podcast, there's Stitcher, my personal favorite, Spotify, and any place else you can find fine podcast.
Absolutely. So go share the State of Us with somebody else, please, and make sure that they're staying up to speed and know that there's an alternative out there to everything else that they're hearing. There is a respite, and hopefully the State of Us can be that for you too. For the State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the State of Us. Be the change.